Hey friends, welcome to episode 536 of the My 123 Cents podcast. For 10 plus years, this show has dropped as a wrestling podcast, a pro wrestling podcast. I've been a pro wrestling fan since the early 1980s, and I have taken that passion, that love for pro wrestling, and turned it into a podcast. And late last year, I decided maybe once a month, I'm going to kind of veer off the wrestling track. So if you are a usual listener or viewer on YouTube and this isn't your jam, I apologize. But I opened up the floor for discussion and got a lot of feedback. So I'm hoping that maybe there are some new people in this space as well. So welcome to you. If you are a wrestling fan and happen to come across this regular wrestling programming, probably 3 Mondays a month will be wrestling centered, wrestling focused, past wrestling, current wrestling. But once a month, and I'm going to try to maybe rotate some guests in from different walks of life that I've met along the way. Because for 22 years of my life, I spent in the TV news business. And 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, I walked away and stepped into the world of marketing, where I continue to work. But I am in a different job, a different place right now. I work at Shawnee Community College in Southern Illinois. So if you are thinking about pursuing a second your career options or whatnot, and I'm kind of rambling, I don't know why, but Shawnee Community College, cheap plug there for the college. But I decided to go into confessions of a former news anchor because I spent 22 years, like I said, in the news business on camera as a reporter, a producer, and 15 of those years I spent as the morning anchor, the morning co-anchor at WSIL TV in Carterville, Illinois. And that's where most of the questions I got were from people who know me from that walk of life. Although there is someone when I worked in Alabama who weighed in and threw a question out as well. And I'm going to go through the questions and answer them honestly. I may not name names in all cases because there are some negative things that we're going to get out of the way first, and then we'll work our way into the more funny and fun and lighthearted portion of the podcast. And for those who are watching, I am wearing, this is the jacket I wore the very first time I ever anchored back in 1997, WOWL. I'm going to give you a quick little history lesson, not lesson, history update on basically what got me to the dance, so to speak. I didn't really know. When I was in college, I did not know what I wanted to do. I wanted to go into something that was going to allow some creativity in the media. So I was studying mass communication the entire time I was at Southeast Missouri State University. Radio was my first thing because I'll be honest, I lacked the confidence to be on TV and to go out and put myself out there in that way. And actually, as I went along the way, kind of learning more about radio, I was very nervous and apprehensive about that as well. But I ended up graduating, and again, with a degree in mass communication media studies. Nothing to do with broadcast, nothing to do with TV. I had some video shooting and editing experience. Got a job part-time at KMOV in St. Louis, Missouri in the fall of the summer of 1996, and pursued that, worked behind the scenes and worked with some of the greatest mentors, reporters, and photographers who took me under their wing, and in a union shop. And if you know anything about the TV business, being in a union, it's a big deal. And they helped me get to where I am today. And I am forever grateful for people like Margie Ellisor and Mark Cox and Nick Zervos, Steve Lattimore. Those are just a few of the reporters and anchors and photographers who helped guide me along this path. And so, not that I think any of them are going to see this or hear this, but I did want to make mention of them being a part of my journey that got me then my first job at WOWL, the Owl in Northwest Alabama, Florence, Alabama. I spent about 18 months there before the station folded and got rid of the news department. And so I was essentially fired because we weren't doing news anymore. And I had a wife who was 4 months pregnant at the time, and we needed to find a job for me quick. And I do have to give a shout out to my wife, who was by my side this entire journey. We met in college our freshman year. I've been together ever since. And without her pushing me at times when I wanted to give up, because getting a job, uh, I said I started at KMOV in 1996, summer of 96. I graduated college in December of 95. So it took time to get to that position. And then from 96 until the fall of 97. So over a year, I looked and made a tape and did different tapes and different resumes and tried to do all things. Went on job interviews, went around driving around the country, handing off tapes and resumes, trying to get my foot in the door. And without her kind of pushing me along the way all of that time, I don't know that I would have been successful and made it. And I do, at the end of the day, at the end, when this chapter, the news chapter of my life ended, I did look at it as a success. But there was a lot of pits in the road, bumps in the road to get there. So I'm eternally grateful for the fact that she was by my side and had my back many times and encouraged me and kept me motivated when there were times that I just wanted to say screw it and be done and not pursue it. But that first job, and somebody asks about salaries, TV news on the local level, smaller markets, there are 200, and I think, and it's been a while since I've looked, I think there's like 212 television markets, and they are based on geography. New York is obviously the biggest market. It's number one. That's New York City. Los Angeles is number two. Chicago is number three. Where we are, because we combine here in Southern Illinois with Southeast Missouri, Western Kentucky, part of Tennessee. The last time I looked, I think it was 81 or 82, somewhere in that range. Where I went in Alabama, it was in the 80s, but the TV station was tiny. We had no news vehicles. We drove our own cars. We had no photographers. It was a staff of four. There were four of us that were reporter slash anchor slash camera person. We did it all, produced, anchored, wrote, the whole 9 yards. And Todd Napier gave me my first break in there. I don't think he's on social media anymore, but Todd, if you happen to see this, thank you, buddy, because I went down to Alabama. It was a 6-hour drive from our home in St. Louis. My wife and I had been married just a few months. We drove down there. I did the interview. And I walked out of that interview feeling very confident. And that was the first time I had felt that way. But the starting salary was $12,000, which I did in today's math is about $25,000, which is not, it is what it is. But it's not the glamorous lifestyle. You're making and raking in all kinds of money. It's just not that way. And you have to buy suit coats and ties and have your hair cut and be shaved and look nice. And you have to do all of these things. And again, the salary is not the best. And I'm not complaining about that. I'm just stating, maybe breaking some misconceptions that people think that, yeah, there are some. Back in the day, I mean, there were local news anchors in the bigger markets, St. Louis, for example, where they were making between $400,000 and $500,000 a year as the news anchors. They were the face of the station. They were what people tuned into. That's why they watched. That's why advertisers then bought advertising on those news channels at those news times. That's why it cost more to advertise during the 5, 6, or 10 p.m. newscast versus, say, the morning newscast, or to advertise during a Saturday night newscast. So the talent was there, and it was bringing in money for stations. And so, we hear about these salaries and people ask about that. So for me, it was never about the money. It was about making a difference, doing something that I was passionate about, that I felt like maybe I can make a change. Maybe people will, see this story, hear this person's story, hear this person's plight, a nonprofit group or whatever it was, whatever I could do to help be a voice for people that maybe were voiceless at that time. And so that was what motivated me along the way to do the TV news gig. And so anyway, I end up in West Lafayette, Indiana. My wife's pregnant. I'm without a job. She was working still in Indiana or in Alabama. I moved to Indiana for about a month and a half until I got insurance and everything. And then she moved up, worked at a TV station, WLFI, Chris Marissi. Thank you for the opportunity. as well. And again, everywhere I went, it's like being a sponge and absorbing and soaking in it because I didn't get this in college. So I went to these markets and I just learned as much as I could. A gentleman by the name of John Strathman would work with me after hours in the evenings, just on anchoring and trying to be a better journalist. I had the work ethic. I was a hard worker. I busted my ass. But as far as the presentation on air, and I know I'm not fooling myself thinking that I was by any means some great news anchor, but I worked at it, and imagine how bad I'd be if I didn't work at it. So I was very passionate though about doing that, and so I would work holidays, work weekends. That's the other thing about the news business that you don't think much about. And I know this past year, some of the stations didn't air news on Christmas and New Year's and gave everybody the day. It wasn't like that. And I'm not being, angry man yelling at clouds or back in my day kind of mentality. But the reality was Christmas mornings, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Easter, Christmas, whatever the holiday, the news was on. It was a 365-day-a-year job. And I knew that going in, and I'm not complaining and I'm not bitter about it. That is just one of those realities that sometimes people don't think. And it's not your typical hours. For me, those last 15 years, I was working, when I first started on the morning shift, it was, going in around 4 a.m. And then as the news came on earlier, I would go in earlier. And then as people kind of shifted and moved around and stuff, there was times where I was going in at midnight. And it just becomes very taxing on your mind, body, and soul. And so, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. That's part of the reason why I dipped when I dipped. Trying to sound hip for the kids out there. So I ended up at WLFI, and I had to sign a 2-year contract when I was there, and I did not want to be there. It was 5.5 hours away from our family in St. Louis. My wife's family and my family were both in the St. Louis area. We had one kid on the way, then another kid while we were there. I wanted to be closer to home, and going to school in Cape at SEMO, I always wanted to go to KFVS 12, and I talked to their news director all the time. We were on the phone probably every month, if not more. And he would always say, try doing this or this and this. And I'm not, and I jumped through hoops, I felt like, and I did just never bit. And so I ended up signing a 2-year contract in Indiana. That second year ended, and I had to either sign or be out of job. So I signed a 3rd year. And then when that 3rd year came up, I'm like, I don't want to sign, which meant no raise. And it meant, what are you going to do? And so I kept looking, and my boss knew. I mean, where I was at, it was market 189. It's a small market. I said there were 212 markets. So, we were at the bottom there. But it was a great station, great opportunities, learned a lot. But I needed to move on. And I wanted to come back to this area, but I wanted to get closer to St. Louis. So I was looking in Springfield, Illinois. I was looking in Springfield, Missouri. I was looking in Southeast Missouri, Southern Illinois, WPSD in Paducah. I looked at all of those stations and markets and whatnot. And so 2 people that I worked with in West Lafayette, Chris Mills and Lindy Thaxton, had both moved to Southern Illinois, to WSIL. Lindy Thaxton, you may remember, was my very first co-anchor here at WSIL. They moved down, and I stayed in touch with them. Chris was a photographer, and Lindy was the anchor, the morning anchor, and they would keep me updated on things. And I came down one time, we were in St. Louis, and I just decided to take the trek down and meet with the news director, Mike Snuffer at the time. And again, I appreciate the opportunity. I thank him for the opportunity as well, because I don't think he wanted to hire me originally, because we had conversations, and, they actually had hired someone else. And probably it was like the day after Christmas of 2003, he called me and he said, listen, we're going to offer you the job to be a reporter. It was to be a reporter, because this woman that they had offered the job to originally had turned it down. This was like right around Thanksgiving. And so later in December, like I said, because he's like, send me another tape. give me some updated stuff, yada, yada, yada. And I did all that. And so he hired me. So then I came in and I wanted to eventually anchor, but I was just happy with the opportunity to report. And so I reported. My schedule varied. I started in January of 04, and my schedule varied. There some weeks, some nights, or some days I was night side, which would meant I came in around 1:30 and worked until about 10:30. And then there were times where I would fill in on the mornings, or I would work midday. I was working Saturdays, all while my wife and two kids were still up in Indiana. So then when my weekends rolled around, which my days off back then were Sunday, Monday. So I would leave Saturday night from the station and drive back up to West Lafayette. We did that for probably about 6 weeks before they moved down here, and we built our home, and everything turned out just fine. But I knew I wanted to eventually anchor and do more of that. And so I was filling in on the weekends, and I was doing some stuff on the mornings, filling in on the mornings. Well, this is going to take you way back. Again, this is 2004. Angie Wyatt was pregnant. She was the 5 o'clock anchor. Her and Eden Schultz anchored the 6, and then Eden and her anchored the 10. But Angie solo anchored the 5. Well, Mark Kiesling was anchoring the morning show with Lindy Thaxton at that time. Well, when Angie went on maternity leave, they moved Mark to the 5 o'clock news. So Mark just anchored the 5 because it only had one anchor, which was Angie. And so they wanted 2 anchors on the morning show. So they moved me into Mark's spot with Lindy. Well, along the way, somebody said to me, hey, I don't know if you've heard, but Mark says that he is going to stay on the 5, which means that this morning anchoring is going to open up as a position. And so I applied for it and got it eventually. But I'm going to tell you, I realize this. I was not a great anchor, and I heard that a lot. And this is before social media. This was before people were calling or emailing or Facebooking or any of that. I just heard it internally, and to the point where I thought I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose this opportunity. But again, I practiced, and I think part of it was complacency, that they didn't want to move people around again. I was really, honestly, and I realized this, I was one of the only male reporters in the newsroom at the time. So they went with those stereotypical male female co-anchor dynamic. And I think that's really, honestly, what gave me that opportunity. And I just stayed there. And through the years, I had several co-anchors kind of come and go and whatnot. And so getting all that to kind of set the table for that's, I spent 15 years, almost to the day, 15 years to the, I was off by about 2 months from anchoring for 15 years. I spent 15 and a half years at WSIL. A couple people ask, a guy named Randy Yule, I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, and then Nancy Bond both ask, basically, why so many people are leaving. And if you are in Southern Illinois, you know that WSIL has had massive turnover. And I don't know what's going on there now in 2025. I'm only going to speak from my previous experiences being there. I worked there from 2004 to 2019. In 2013, I was told that if I had to do it over again, I would not have hired you to anchor. And I thought, by that point, I'm 9 years into this. I was flying high. I was, and then it just took the wind out of my sails when that was said to me. And it was at that exact moment in 2013 that I said to myself, I've got to get out of here. But we did not want to move from Southern Illinois. Our family, we moved here and had a 3rd kid by this point, did not want to leave the area. And I knew going into TV somewhere else, I was going to end up back on that bottom rung of the ladder. I was going to be doing weekends or, doing things that I did not want to do. I had built up a little bit of seniority here. So I decided it's time to get out of the news business. It's time to find another option. which marketing seemed like a natural fit. Social media was growing, and I knew, I was kind of proficient in doing some things. I was writing blogs and doing things on YouTube. And so I was preparing for that kind of exit. And I'll be honest, I went on several interviews, job interviews, was a finalist for a handful of positions, was offered one that was not anywhere near the salary range that I needed it to be. So I just kind of stayed stuck. And I was working when I wasn't at WSIL, I was working, and when you're not on TV, the morning show was by this point on from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. and then you did the cut-ins. But there's hours beforehand getting ready for the show and then hours afterward preparing for the next day's show. So there's a lot, you're only seeing us on TV for 2.5 hours with the cut-ins and whatnot. So there's a lot that goes in behind the scenes. So anyway, 2013, I'm looking, interviewing, not getting jobs, getting job offers, not taking them, yada, yada, yada. And knowing I've got to get out of here because I'm just, I didn't feel wanted or appreciated, and I knew that I needed to get out. And so I was fortunate and met Whitney Roberts, who owns Idea Creative Marketing. She was a guest on the morning show and talking about they were doing a campaign called I can't remember what it was called. It was a campaign they were doing for collecting food for the food pantries through Silkworm, and they were doing it at Rent One Park at the time. Strike Out Hunger or something along. I'm sorry, I'm butchering the name. But anyway, we met and kind of stayed in touch. And I was writing some freelance blogs. I freelancing for her. I was writing some freelance blogs for Tom Harness and his company, and then some other friends that were needing blogs for their businesses. I was doing all of that, and so I was building up that experience, if you will, because I knew I was not getting these jobs in marketing because I didn't have the marketing experience. And so the summer of 2018, I had reached my wit's end and I was frustrated as hell. And I emailed Whitney and I said, listen, is there any possibility of working for you on a full-time basis? And so she said, come in on whatever day and we'll talk. And so I went in and I interviewed with her, kind of told her what my plan was. At that time, it was her. She had a freelancer as a graphic artist, Elizabeth, but it was Whitney running the show. And she's like, I'm looking to grow. And so I started that Monday working part-time. So I was working at WSIL in the mornings, doing my 8 hours plus there. And then I was going to her in the afternoons. I'd come home, I'd eat lunch. This was when I was doing the stupid running streak. So I would run and then I would go work at Idea Creative until it was time to go pick my daughter up from school. I did that starting in August. And then in October, I get a call while I was at Idea Creative from the station saying, we need you to come in for a mandatory meeting. So I had no idea what it was about. Told Whitney, and she's like, if something happens, I'm ready for you to go full time. And so I walked out of Idea Creative that day with the biggest set of confidence that I'd ever had, because I thought, if I am getting, because I really didn't know what was going on. I was just a mandatory meeting at the station. That's all I knew. Didn't know if everybody was coming to this meeting, if it was just for me, because I didn't know. So I get there and they announced that Bonnie and Steve Wheeler were selling the station to Quincy Media. And there were folks from Quincy there and everybody talked and, we learned and figured out. And I'm like, okay, well, the timing's coming out perfect because I do have this backup plan. And so the whole deal with that didn't really the transition didn't happen until like January. And all along the way, they knew that I was working at Idea Creative. I don't think they were thrilled about it, but I wasn't violating anything. And I was, I don't think anybody thought I was leaving WSIL either. But along the way, I never talk to anybody about staying, getting a contract, anything like that. They were signing other talents to contracts and stuff. And I'm like, I'm just going to mind my own business. I'm going to come in, do my thing, and then I'm getting the hell out. And sure enough, I had decided in May of that year of 2019 that June we were going on a family vacation, and when we came back, I would be done. And so made the announcement. I gave 4 weeks notice, and Whitney welcomed me with open arms. And so that's why I left. I was struggling with a lot of things, and I needed a change, and I needed to get out. The mass exodus now, I know that, the station has been sold 2 other times since that initial sale to Quincy since 2019. Ownership, corporate bottom lines, budget cuts, and all this, that, and the other. I'm guessing that's part of it, that you're seeing some of these talents leave, not necessarily on their own, but they're, my plan was to retire from WSIL. I was going to continue to anchor the morning news for as long as they would have me, and as long as my, heart and body and everything held out for it. But, things happen, and it doesn't go that way. And so, I know that others left along the way just because they wanted to change. They didn't like the way things were going. They didn't want to leave Southern Illinois. I love Southern Illinois. So I think that's part of it. And you are seeing a lot of talent coming in now that is right out of school. Whereas back in the day, you would have to have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years of experience before coming into a market like this. That's not just WSIL. That's the news business in general these days. There's a lot more younger talent coming in because A, you can pay them less, and B, there's a shortage. I mean, there's a legitimate shortage of news anchors and reporters and weather people, photographers, producers, the whole 9 yards. So it's a changing business. It's an evolving business, and I'm 100% glad that I hopped off when I did, when I dipped when I dipped. And that's where I come to Dylan Hoffman, who I met through social media. He's also a wrestling fan, but he said, as a former news anchor myself, I know leaving the industry is a big decision. What do you see as the biggest pros and cons of getting out of the business? Well, I think I've mentioned most of the pros. It significantly improved my mental health almost immediately. I was not tired I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say I probably was getting between 4 and 4.5 hours of sleep a night, which made me irritable. I was, a dick to my family, and it just was not the greatest experience. And so that was one thing. And then being able to stay up late and go to away games when my kids were playing in sports, and being able to, things that some people may take for granted, the Super Bowl, for example, Sunday night, we would leave the Super Bowl party that we were at halftime because I would have to, get up in the middle of the night to go to work. And so being able to enjoy, I went to Sunset concerts for the first time ever because those were on Thursday nights in Carbondale. So being able to stay out late, and by late, I mean 8, 9, 10 o'clock, was a game changer. Con wise, I mean, I miss my friends, but now, 6 years later, most everybody that I worked with has already left WSIL, and thanks to social media, and it's just down the road. I do talk to and see folks, so it's that would be the one con, is just not maybe seeing the people and being out of the know. It was nice knowing things that were going on, and I don't watch the news nearly as much. I mean, I'm not anywhere near, if we watch the news 3 or 4 nights a week, that's a lot. And so I don't feel as informed as I did before, but I also feel maybe a little happier about all that as well. Tony Gottschalk asks, did you ever have a story that you inadvertently laughed about on the air? Yes, I laughed a lot, and it didn't help Weston White, who's producer, still a good friend of mine that we talk every day through text or through Snapchat or social media. He loved to crack us up. And if I would say something, I would try to make like a joke, and then in our ear on our IFB, he would go goo, and he would make these weird noises, and sometimes it broke me. And there are clips I have on my YouTube channel. I have some bloopers and stuff. One that really stands out where it was probably not the appropriate time to be laughing. It was a story. It was a health story that we ran about a young man who was blind, and he was playing the guitar and singing, and it wasn't a local story. It was not a local story. Not that saying this is going to make it any better, but he was not good. But that's what they decided to showcase was his, and he like hits this note towards the end of the song, and that's the end of the story. And we're all laughing in the studio. Well, we come out and I'm on air, and of course I'm the one that's laughing and looking like the schmuck. But that was probably the most inappropriate laughter that I had. I'm trying to think back to some of the other times because, even in Alabama, not so much in Indiana. I really never anchored in Indiana, but in Alabama, I anchored quite a bit as well. My very first night was a nightmare where I busted out laughing during a story as well. But it was a lighthearted story, so it was a little more appropriate. Tom also asked, did you have any other tongue twisting moments that you had to bite your tongue and not curse on the air? This is going to tie in. I'll get to the cursing part in a few minutes because it's going to tie in with some other stuff. Other than the one moment that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, I don't know that there were any cursings on the air, and not really ever that I had to bite my tongue. Now, I would get tongue tied, and there are certain words that I can't pronounce. I remember the first time there's a grocery store, or there was a grocery store here in town called IGA. It was Boroviac, but it was spelled kind of weird. There's a W in there. And I didn't know how to say it. And so I called it Borowac. That was one. Aluminum, for whatever reason, I could not say a lot of times. And I would always kind of try to find another word to say. Pierogi, I don't remember what I called it, but so yeah, there were times that I got tongue twisted or just simply could not or didn't know how to say certain words. And sometimes you just power through it and keep going and hope nobody notices. And social media obviously more prominent now, so people are all the time kind of calling that stuff out. Back in the day, though, I don't feel like we got called out as much. Maybe internally we did, but not by viewers. Deborah Turner asks, when doing the news, did you ever get tickled about something funny and couldn't stop laughing? Yes, and kind of just talked about that. Also, I would try. I have a lot of stupid, bad dad jokes, and I would try to make a joke. And depending on the reaction, I can remember one time with Melissa Cohn, I said something. She did a story about Reese Witherspoon, and I said, "Hey, do you know how Reese eats her cereal?" And then, of course, the joke is Witherspoon. And so making stupid, I'm cracking myself up now thinking about it. But and again, Weston being in my ear, if Weston wasn't in my ear for a lot of those moments, I don't think I would have laughed as much as I did, but he would always get us. And those were the fun days. I loved those times. And sometimes we'd get chewed out and yelled at or whatever, but it was fun. It was meant to be lighthearted and fun at times. And I think we were serious and did our job appropriately when the time was right as well. Blair Krieger, I believe that's how he says his last name. Do you ever do a segment in a sports coat and shorts, since the shorts wouldn't show up under the desk? And Mary Jones asks a similar question. Did you wear a complete suit and dress pants, or did you have shorts or jeans on under the desk? So 99.9% of the time I had on dress pants. Now I can think of a handful of times wear a pajama to work day, or we would do a segment in our pajamas and there wasn't time to like switch out of pants right there in the studio. So I wear my pajamas under the desk, but I always had a pair of dress pants ready to go in case there was breaking news, in case we had to leave and go out and cover something. I didn't want to show up to the scene of a murder wearing a pair of Smurf pajamas, for example. Shorts, I don't think, because in the mornings it was never really hot out, so it was never that big of an issue. I remember wearing shorts once when I was working in Indiana, was a reporter, one-man band, which meant you shot your own video. I remember being out shooting the story, and it was about a pool party at a radio station. And so, but the pool party, because it's radio, you think, oh, pool party, it's it. But the reality was it was one of those little plastic pools. And we kind of like exposed it, not in a negative way. It was all meant, they invited us up and it was all meant to be. And again, this is before social media. So it was all meant to be fun. And so I went up there and it was a hot summer day. I'm wearing a polo and a pair of shorts. And when I got back to the studio and I had to front it from the newsroom, well, they wanted me in a shirt and tie. So you really only see, if you're watching on YouTube right now, you're seeing what you're seeing now. It's just my torso. And I only remember this specifically because somebody took a picture of me with a Polaroid camera. And it's me in my shorts and my slip-on shoes and my shirt and tie and jacket. So maybe I wasn't wearing a jacket, but anyway, so most of the time, and we would have guests in on the morning show as well. And so I always wanted, and my co-anchors were the same way, but we always wanted it to be professional and not necessarily. Now, jeans, I did wear jeans from time to time, but for the most part, I had on khakis or dress pants of some kind, suit pants that went with the jacket, or just a nice pair of pants. So Kristen Shelby, what is the most embarrassing thing you've done on air? This is going to tie it to the cursing. So when I worked in Alabama, and by this point, I was the news director as well. So Todd Napier, the man that I mentioned earlier, Jennifer Engelwright, who took over for him, they had both left. And again, this was a sinking ship at that point. People knew the writing was kind of on the wall, and we knew news was not the priority. We didn't know how soon the plug was going to be pulled, but we knew eventually the plug was going to be pulled because they were switching from NBC to UPN affiliation. So for the newscast, and this was, again, tiny little market, I anchored, produced it. And so back in that time, we didn't have a computer in the newsroom. We were working on typewriters, and our scripts were, our rundowns were generated by pencil. And so I would fill out all the stories on this sheet, and then I would put the times in, and then you back timed it. So you took and you went from the end of the show to the top and deducted the time from each story. And ultimately you want to hit that 6 o'clock start time. You want that, start at 6:30, work your way back up to 6. And you're hoping that everything, and sometimes you'd have to add stories or take stories out based on the length of the stories. So an arduous process, and I could probably explain it better at some other time, but I'm telling you all this to say, as the producer though, I'm handing everything over when I'm on the air, because now the director, I've given him the keys to help with the timing, because I didn't have a way to time it and anchor it at that time. WSIL, I did it all the time when I filled in as the producer and anchor. But here, the director did it, and we wore earpieces, IFBs, in our ears, and we're sitting out on the news desk, and then he would communicate, he being the director would communicate with us. And I know there's a director out there that is probably going to see this, that worked there at WOWL back then. It is not you that I'm talking about, and I think he knows that. But on this particular night, we had our floor director out there, and it was me and my co-anchor, and we're anchoring. Show starts. First couple stories, nothing. We say news scene 15's fill in the reporter's name has the story, and you're supposed to roll the package. Well, it doesn't roll. And we're just sitting there, and there's like, okay, nobody's communicating in our ear what's going on. The floor director is not telling us what's going on. So we just continue going with the flow. Okay, well, we're having technical difficulties with that story. Let's move on to the next one and read. And then the video would play. Then we'd get to another story, and the video wouldn't play. And it was like, what is going on? And so we finally get to a story where the video is playing, and it is the superintendent of schools of Alabama, and he's talking. It's a SOT, sound on tape. So he's talking. So I'm like, okay. I go, what in the F is going on in there? To which I hear now the first time in the 10 minutes that we're on the air, or 8 minutes, whatever time it is, that I hear something, Kevin, your microphone was open for that. So you saw, as a viewer, the video playing of the superintendent of Alabama schools, but you hear me saying, what in the F is going on in there? Although I didn't say F. I was so embarrassed. One, because I lost my cool, but two, I said the ultimate word. And so my coworker at the time looked at me, and I'm not going to name names, although I don't think she would care, but she said, get that air check. Well, the air check is what they recorded the newscast on. So as soon as the newscast ended, I popped that air check out and it went away. I didn't get in trouble. My boss came in the next day and said, oh, I heard you had a little slip up on the air. And he chuckled and laughed about it. There was no outrage. There was no post. There was nothing to post on back then because there was no social media, but no phone calls, nobody angry or anything like that. But it was embarrassing because, again, I just kind of lost my cool, and it wasn't the best look, but it was something that we kind of laughed about afterward, and laughed at for a long time after that. Larry Hunter asks, and Larry was a colleague at WSIO, what on-air experience do you look back on and think, why did I do that? I've been pondering that question. I've been thinking about it, and other than, screwing up some words or some names or something, I don't really look back on anything that we did. We had, especially at Channel 3, we had fun. We were a family a lot of the time. Most of the time, it felt very family on air. And those people that I still keep in touch with and talk to, they were my friends. They were my brothers and sisters, for lack of a better word. And I know that sounds cliche and cheesy, but they meant the world to me, and we all bonded, and we're working in the middle of the night and not on much sleep, and we're doing our best. So I don't know, maybe the llama, which Chad Pippin asked about the llama. I've told the llama story before, but having the llama in and that whole debacle, but it was fun and it made for a great story. So I don't regret that, and I don't think, why did I do that, or why did we do that? But for me, again, probably the slip up of the cussing on the air would be the thing. Meteorologist Katie Melvin, who used to work at Channel 3. I never met Katie, but she did ask on Facebook, expose meteorologist Nick Hausen for the diva he is. Laughy face emojis. So Nick is great. I love Nick. I see Nick still from time to time. We cross paths with our respective jobs. And so Nick and I are, oh gosh, probably 12 or 13, 14 years apart in age, but we grew up in the same county in Missouri. We refer to ourselves as Jeffco boys. And so Nick and I bonded over that when he was there. I enjoyed working with Nick a lot. I follow his weather app. If you don't, download it if you are in Southern Illinois. It's Nick Hausen Weather. But Nick was a great guy, and I can still remember. And this is the Nick story that I tell, and it has nothing to do with him being a diva, because he really, and Katie was kidding, but I did use this as an excuse to tell this story. Nick, when he first started there, and I mean, we're all, and this was his first. He came from Mizzou in Columbia, Missouri, where they had a TV station there that the students worked at as well. But like, this was his first job out of college. And I remember we're all greener than goose poop when we start, and, you learn and you get better and you get experience. But Nick was filling in and doing work on all the newscasts. And I remember, and I think it was toward the end of, it was a longer weather segment that he was getting ready to do from the weather wall. It might've been his first. I don't know if it was the first one. Anyway, I mean, we're 10 seconds before coming back on air, and our floor director, Josue at the time, who eventually became a director, he said, hey, is that black truck out there yours? And Nick's like, yeah. And he goes, oh, all four of your tires are flat. And like the color drained from Nick's face, and he was like, what? And it was kind of mean. I don't know if mean's the right word, but I felt bad for Nick, because he's about to, then the weather bed opens, the music plays, and he's on the air. But Josue fessed up and told him he was just messing around with it. But that was kind of the initiation for Nick, and we love Nick, and I think the world of him and Hillary, his wife, and they are great people that I think Nick was one of the good ones at WSIL. And again, follow his weather app. Okay, so Ken Johnson, who has been a longtime supporter of the podcast and someone that I actually met many, many years ago, probably 16, 17 years ago, was a guest on the morning show. And then, of course, social media, we became friends and we talk occasionally on social media. And again, a big supporter, and I'm thankful and grateful for that, Ken. So thank you. And he has several questions. And so we're going to just jump in, and this will be the last hurrah of questions until next time. But he asked about my favorite and least favorite stories. Not necessarily a story, but my favorite moment at Channel 3 was the tasering. And I've talked about it. We've shown the videos. It's on YouTube. Producer Weston convinced Emily Eddington and I to do a segment on tasing. And we brought in a professional, and people have done tasing before at the station as a recorded story, but we'd never done it live, and we had never really we had the time to really explain what goes into the training and why they do it. And it wasn't just for the, pardon the pun, the shock value of doing the tasering. But it has become, we did that, I think it was 2010 or 2011, and it is still, to this day, one of the things that I'm asked about the most from my experiences. And so I enjoyed that. And another, not a favorite in terms of, favorite is a relative word here, but the Leap Day tornado in 2012, February 29th, 2012, about 10 minutes or a couple minutes before 5 a.m., a deadly tornado went through Harrisburg, Illinois. This was back when we went on the air at 5:30 in the morning. Nick was there, by the way, that morning as backup to Clint Misselhorn, who was the morning meteorologist at the time, but Nick was there because severe weather was coming through. And Nick and I talked right before it hit, and he said, Clint was on kind of voicing over stuff on air and giving people updates. And he said, this is going to be bad. And sure enough, it was. And around 5:15, we went on the air. Clint had been on, but then Emily Eddington and I, and Weston did ask, tell us about your favorite and least favorite former coworkers and name names. Emily and I had a special bond. She was the little sister I never had. I really, to this day, we talk and so we had chemistry that was really made going to work fun and being a part of that. So I'm not going to go into favorite and least favorite former coworkers. If we still talk and are still in touch on social media or talk via text or Snapchat, then you're on my favorite list. And so people can figure out the rest. But I have very few former coworkers that I don't that I would put on my least favorite list. I'll put it that way. But anyway, obviously I guess I'm showing my hand a little bit with Emily, but for then the next 7 hours, Emily and I co-anchored from the desk. Clint was doing weather, and then eventually we had reporters coming in that were reporting from the scene in Harrisburg. No commercial break. I mean, 7 hours wall to wall. I would get up, and because I have a little baby bladder, so I would get up and run to the restroom if we threw it out to the field, or if Clint was doing another weather report, I would run, use the restroom, and come back. But that moment, that day is etched in my memory, and it was one of those moments where we all came together, we bonded, and I feel like things just kind of all of us, from the folks that were behind the scenes to the ones that were on air doing that, it just made us a tighter knit group. And I can't explain that, but it was just kind of one of those experiences because we're talking about real life and death and destruction and lives that were changed forever as a result of that tornado. And it was one of those moments that and our coverage, not just the morning show coverage, but the coverage that happened all throughout the rest of that day, ended up winning an award from the Illinois Broadcasters Association. So I'm very proud of that effort from our team, of everyone that was behind the scenes, that were printing out things from the newsroom, that were running them out to us, that were helping us update the teleprompters, that were keeping us informed in our earpieces, that were out in the field, on the scene, across the board. It was just a team effort that you can't beat. And so I'm very appreciative and thankful to have had that. As far as a least favorite story, I mean, when you're reporting on death and destruction, I mean, all of that stuff is least favorite for sure. Worst topics to cover: death of children always gutted me. I remember in Indiana, there was a baby, days old, that was found in a creek, I believe it was, and they had a funeral for this baby that they didn't know who it was. The state police had put together a funeral, and they were investigating and whatnot. But I remember asking my boss, "Can I have this story?" Which was not in my usual wheelhouse. And she even asked, "Are you sure that you want to do that?" Because I had 2 small kids at the time. And I said, "Yeah, I want to." And I can remember going and doing the story. And I'm proud of the work that we did on that, me and my photographer. I remember getting back to the station, sitting out on the anchor desk with the 2 anchors, and we did I set up the story from the desk and whatever. And from the time I walked away from the desk and made it right outside the studio, I just fell apart. And that was probably the worst I felt after a story. It hit me all at once, and my photographer saw it, and he was like, "Are you all right?" And we just cried together. And it was just one of those moments that I thought I could handle it. I thought I'd be all right. And I ended up not being able to. And I remember crying from the desk on the day of the Harrisburg tornado as well. So there are times where it does get to you, and you do your best to hide that, or, not put that out there. But sometimes your emotions do get the best of you. Ken also wants to know what happened to the restaurant report card. So Restaurant Report Card was a segment that we did where we would get the health inspection reports from the different counties every month. And then what I would do with that, and what Emily Finnegan, who preceded me with the restaurant report, I took it over after she left. Each county would send in those reports on pieces of paper, individual reports. Like, we had the hard copies. They didn't do it digitally back then. And I say back then, this was like 2014 is when I took it over. So, but I would take all those reports, and then I would put them in alphabetical order by restaurant name for each county. And then I would go through and I would figure out which ones we're going to highlight and do stories on and whatever. And back then they would go in and grade. They would start off with a score of 100, and then they would deduct points along the way. And so whatever they took off points for, each violation had a designated number, and then they would get points taken away based on that. And so for some reason, I believe it was the start of 2019. So right before I left Channel 3, it might have been 2018. I don't remember, but somewhere along the way the state was doing the inspections changed. And so they were no longer doing numbers. You weren't going to get an 86 or a 95 or a 63, which we saw restaurants that got bad grades too. So they were not doing it that way anymore. It was basically a pass or fail kind of situation. And I think it didn't translate as well as the numbers did. I think that was part of the reason. And I wasn't going to push to continue to do it if management didn't want me to do it. And so we just kind of mutually all said, we're done with it. And I think years later, they tried to revive it because after I left, somebody contacted me and said, "Hey, how did you do Restaurant Report? Like, how did you get the stuff?" And I told them what I did, but I never saw it revived or come back. Ken asked if it paid well. I kind of talked about that earlier. No, it didn't. It was all right. It was what it was, but it did. I would not say paid well. Did you want to move up the ladder and maybe run a TV station or a news broadcast? I did not want to move into the ownership side of things. There was a time not long before I left that I actually had thought about management. News director. I was a news director at my first station, but it was a very small station, and it wasn't like very hard as far as like managing 3 or 4 people. But I had considered that. I had thought about it, but at the end of the day, again, I was defeated and done, and I wanted to get out of the industry all on its own. So, how do contracts work with news people? So, depending on the contract, depending on the talent, and I don't, I don't know how they work now, but I'm just speaking from my experiences. You had a contract that said that you, and this is not just at WSIL, I'm talking about other places that I've worked. You had a designated dollar amount that you were going to make in that year. And then, but you had to stay the year. You could not leave. Now, sometimes they weren't as enforced. People could get out of their contracts. Sometimes they weren't worth the paper they were written on. I signed a contract when I started at WSIL for 1 year in 2004, and that was the only contract I ever had. I was never under any other contract. Now, I know that some stations, they put you under a contract, you're under it for 3 years, and at the end of each year, the station has the option to not keep you. A lot of times it's more of the benefit of the drafter of the contract than it is the person, the employee that's working. Back in the day, there were no compete contracts, so you couldn't, if you worked at Channel 3, you couldn't then jump and go work at Channel 12 or Channel 6. Now, I think no competes are illegal, or they're not as enforced in some states, and I think in Illinois they're illegal. So I know at one time, they talked at KFVS, you couldn't go from there to St. Louis. I never understood that. And again, that's what somebody told me years ago. I don't know how true that is. So, but yeah, contracts have changed a lot, I think, over the years. I don't have a ton of experience with contracts, so that's what I know of the contract experience. Did the main network ever make you say a line, or did you all write those stories locally? I know you had to cover US news and world news, but I didn't know who was responsible for the script. So they didn't make us say anything, and I don't think you're asking like, was I ever told to say a certain thing, which that never at any station that I ever worked at. And I've worked for NBC, ABC, and CBS affiliates. You would get content from the news feed, and other most of that stuff was coming from other affiliates across the country. So, for example, since we're talking about WSIL, when I worked at WSIL, all of the other ABC stations, let me back up. There would be, when I worked in Alabama, for example, I was at an NBC affiliate, and every morning around 9 o'clock, there was a call with all of the NBC stations in Alabama, and we would talk to our region coordinator, whatever their title was. And they would say, "What are you working on today?" And we would rattle off a couple of stories that may be of statewide interest. A lot of us would pick up the stuff that was going on in Montgomery because that's the state capital. We wanted to know what was going on. But then somebody would have a fun story or a neat story, something unique, something controversial, and they'd say, "Yeah, we're doing this." And then we would all say, "Oh, hey, I'd like that story." So then they would make arrangements to get that story fed to the network, and then they would feed it out. And so then every station, every NBC affiliate across the country then had access to that. And each station or each state and each region would do this. So then you've got the Southwest region, we were all funneling stories in, but everybody then had access to it. And I'm guessing it's still like that. Is the same, some stations are CNN affiliates where you subscribe then and you're paying to get that stuff. Other news sources, the AP, the Associated Press, those stories are already written. Now you can tweak them. I try not to change the facts on them, but you can write them to where they're more conversational, or you write them to where they maybe are more suited to your market. They may send that story coming in from Mobile and say local taxpayers. Well, in Florence, Alabama, that wasn't a local story anymore. So you would say taxpayers in Mobile, for example. And that's just a quick little example of that. You're not changing or you're not supposed to be changing the overarching point of the story or any of that. But I'm sure misinterpretations or whatever, obviously me being the reporter on the story, I know what it's about. And so I'm writing this and now I'm sending it off to our network liaison who's then feeding it out. And hopefully, and that's where, Conan O'Brien, I ended up on Conan O'Brien one time because we had taken the script and we just kept it the way it was. And I said the line, and then it was like, say the line, Bart, from The Simpsons, where all these other TV stations around the country did the same line. And so Conan O'Brien would put a compilation together of all these news anchors. And of course, I show up. That may be one of the embarrassing moments of saying that and being a part of that and not changing the script. And by changing, not changing the meaning of it, but just wording it differently or coming at it from a different angle. So that's it. Those are the questions. I am super, super appreciative, and I rambled for a very long time, and I hope you stayed the whole time here. If you like this concept, if you like this idea of doing things outside the wrestling bubble, come back for more. Subscribe on YouTube. You can subscribe wherever you get podcasts. This show drops every Monday, usually around midnight, and I share it on my social media channels. So reach out, let me know, and I'll look to do some shows with some guests and do more fun things like this, hopefully, along the way. I had fun. It was nice to vent a little bit. I hope I wasn't too negative, but I appreciate you listening and or watching to this week's show, and we will see you next time. Kevin Huntsberger, News 3.